from that, the four big numbers and what is behind the numbers. I could have chosen many other examples, but I just thought that they summarise why we are here today. 3 million slaves taken from Africa, worked to death, and let's be honest, they were worked to death, most of them, creating wealth for this country that was sent back and then to England and the UK, and then we bought more slaves, and so it continued for many hundreds of years. 4 million Indians, and additionally to that, that isn't so much I didn't mention in there, is 200 billion was taken from India as a loan that we never paid back. 400 billion. Would we have won World War II and World War One without Indian help? Don't know about that. 42 trillion pounds, an estimate of how much money we took out of from India, just from India. You can argue about that being high or low, but the point is we went into India, we destroyed they had 27% of the world's market in terms of clothes. When we first went in, they were doing pretty well. By the end of it, it was negligible, 1%. And we moved that over to the dark satanic mills that you might have heard about in England. And if you watch the video that I suggest you're going to watch in a moment, then you can see, you'll get some more detail on that. And then finally, Windrush, having been through slavery, having families survive slavery, they then fight in World War One, they then fight in World War Two, and then 1948, we say in this country, with our economy in ruins, with the newly set up National Health Service, we need people to come over and rebuild the country and work in the National Health Service and work on transport and work in the hospitals, and doctors, and many Indian doctors came over during this period as well. We said come over, they come over, and then in 2018 we take away the visa rights. Statues behind me to all of those events. Statues to all of those events from one side, from the people, the slave owners. But there are no statues to the 4 million Indian troops, to the Bengal famine, which you should read about the Bengal famine if you want to see an awful episode in this country's history, and Windrush. So lots of pause for thought, lots of things to think about, and that's what this is about. So we're going to move on now, and I hope you enjoyed those images. The last two images I'm going to talk about in a bit more detail in a moment. 3 million slaves were taken from West Africa. Most of them were taken to the Caribbean by the UK. There they stayed as slaves, working on sugar plantations, coffee and so on, producing goods that were then shipped back to Britain, and then it went back to West Africa with the profits, and so the cycle began. You had slaves thrown overboard, you had the conditions on the slave ships, as you can see from this diagram above, were appalling. Numerous slaves died en route, and this went on from 1500 to about 1850. And the remarkable thing about slaves is the amount of money it generated for our economy. 20% of the economy, so many of the buildings and so on that you see now will have been built on, especially in places like Liverpool and London and Bristol, will have been built on slave money. And Bristol is where this was filmed. The picture that on the screen, your screen was, this is Colson, who was a slave owner, 90,000 slaves, numerous died, and he is the statue that was thrown into the water and pulled down by protesters. And you can see what they've done here, and this poses an interesting debate for you. That at some point during one of the protests, they put a mock-up of a ship, and you can see that there are many slaves lying there, like the boat above me, to try and make the point that he made his money in that way. So the big question you've got to ask is, should a slave trader, should Coulson's statue have been taken down in the manner it was? Okay, this next slide shows the Indians who gave their lives, and there were many lives lost, and for the UK in World War One, 1.5 million of them, and in World War Two, 2.5 million. And there are statues all over the country to commemorate the dead. And if you go to London, you've got Winston Churchill's statue, which is in Trafalgar Square, but there is no statue in there, and there's no recognition in a lot of museums to the sacrifices made by the Indians in World War One and World War Two, just prior to partition. In addition to that, India as a country contributed billions and billions of pounds, loans that were never taken back to the country, as we'll look at in a minute. So the question is it right there are no statues or museums for the Indian soldiers? You've got a picture on this picture. You've got one of the famines that happened in 1943 during the war, when actually food was moved that could have saved lives to a different area by Churchill, and this causes some controversy. There's some controversy about this. So, would we have won World War I and World War II without India? I don't think so. At the same time as slavery was going on, we had Britain was colonised, and it colonised all over the world. And I've picked on India because of the magnitude of the amount of money that came out as a result of this. But you could equally well as look at Ireland, look at Kenya, look at Yemen, and some of the things that went on there, even as late as 1950 in Kenya. If you want to do some further research, have a look at what this country was responsible for there. So between 1750 and 1948, we extracted 43 trillion pounds from India. The East Indian Company was in charge in India prior to this period of the British Raj, and the East India Company had the right to collect taxes. So you had this ridiculous situation where someone would come around from the East India Company to collect taxes off people who made goods or whatever, disappear again, and someone else would come back to buy their goods with the money that they'd just given. And because they were different people, it was fraud. The East Indian Company was doing this for many, many years. So in 1950, the most fascinating instance for me in my research for this was that by about 1850, slavery in the Caribbean had ended. This obviously left landowners with a real shortage of labour. Who did they turn to fill that gap? They brought in 500,000 indentured workers from India and treated them pretty much the same as slaves to take over the slaves' jobs in the Caribbean. So the colonisation and slavery were inextricably linked in India and the Caribbean. Another statue for you, and remember, it's what's behind the statue, not the statue itself. This is Clive of India in Shropshire. Should Clive of India be there? Should we pay compensation to India, or should we apologise? 43 trillion is quite a lot of money to find. I think we've probably spent it. What do you think? The final piece of information that we've looked at today in our lightning history of or decolonised history, you might say, is about Windrush. From around after the war, and remember, Caribbean soldiers fought as well as Indian soldiers. I chose India because of the magnitude of the numbers, but the Caribbean soldiers had fought in World War I and in World War II. After they were freed from being slaves, a lot of them carried on to do this. And in 1948, this country was in a real state. We had a shortage of labour. We had, buildings destroyed, a National Health Service that had just been set up, and we needed people. And who provided those people? Well, 500,000 people came over from the Caribbean between 1948 and 1973. Many of them came on this famous boat, the Empire Windrush, and their families are still here today. But the the tragic thing was in 2016, Theresa May's clamp down on immigration led to many of these people being sent back, persecuted, losing their job, losing their right to healthcare, and it was an enormous scandal, which I'm not going to go into in great detail now, but I really do suggest you check what happened in the Windrush scandal of 2000, and just to find out how we treated these people and their families after they came over to rebuild our economy. So, do ethnic minorities still face racism and prejudice? Well, I think you know the answer to that because of the Black Lives Matter protests that happened before the summer and are still carrying on now. Week in Badly Written News, which is about English maths and mindset, where we need to try and develop our maths. And this week's topic, obviously being slavery and colonisation, is about exactly that, slavery and colonisation. So there are 3 questions that you can see there. Just behind me are the answers. You might want to pause for a moment and see if you can work out the questions. And then in a few seconds, I will reveal them. Okay, so hopefully you will. There are estimated 12 million slaves. We had 3 million in the UK. What percentage is that? How many soldiers were there in total in World War I? And so how many police officers should there be if they were to reflect society? And the answers are as you can see here. 25%, 9,000,000 and 17,502. Is to have a read of this. Some of you may have decided that statues should be taken down, or statues, some statues should be changed or whatever. This puts a different perspective across, and it's got in each paragraph there's one spelling, one punctuation and one grammar. So you might want to pause this because I'm about to move on to the next slide and show you the answers to this, which I will do now. And there are the answers. So again, you can have a look and see how you did. Did you spot the spelling, punctuation and grammar? Okay, so the next task we're going to look at is to get you to think about how you can use information to develop your skills to pass the GCSE exam, because paper 2, question 5, which is worth 25% of the overall marks, will ask you to do something. It will ask you to express your opinion and justify it, and it wants you to have your opinion. So it will ask you to write a letter arguing a point of view. One of the examples recently was cars and pollution. Should you ban them from city centres? It might ask you to write a speech, slightly different, more emotive language perhaps, about what you think education is more than just school. And you can have two perspectives, and you can't be wrong, and it doesn't matter what your perspective is as long as you argue your point. You might write an article for a newspaper. You've seen some newspapers today, sort of tabloid headlines. So if it's a tabloid, they might expect you to do it in a slightly more tabloidy, chatty style, whereas if it was a broadsheet, it might be written more formally. And they asked you, the question for that one was, sport is all about money, fundamentally, and discuss. And then they argue for or against a statement in a broadsheet. Parents today are overprotective. So that would be a more formal language. And again, you'd have a headline and so on. So in answer to the question, ethnic minorities built, fought and rebuilt the economy. Many of today's statues should be taken down, and you could argue both points that you've seen in the work so far. And it's essential that you do a plan and you decide, I'm going to put these points in paragraph 1, these points in paragraph 2, these points in paragraph 3. In every single examiner's report, it says that people do not plan properly for the GCSE. You probably know enough now to answer the question, but if you start off and just write, you'll write things that will bump into each other and you won't be able to separate out your arguments. And it doesn't matter if you argue all statues should be taken down. That time in history, they were the rich. You could go for a money angle about the fact that people were wealthy and afforded it. You could go on about the fact that people were never asked about statues and should be, and you could go on about the fact we've got more modern day heroes. Or you could say, no, we should keep the statues there, maybe move a few to museums. You could concede that statues are part of our history. However, we should put plaques next to them, or what they did with Coulson's statue, where they put a slave ship and so on, so we give more information. So you can argue two different points there, and as long as you put forward an argument in paragraphs with a plan so that it all hangs together, you've got a very good chance of picking up enough marks to get you through the GCSE. The images at the beginning, the content of this, have been delivered to you by a white European guy. The same people who wrote history, the same people who colonise the curriculum. And I think it's important, we're going to finish off in a moment with some images of women in today's Britain who have achieved a great deal and who are fighting against the background of discrimination. Gina Miller, who's just above me, took the government to court and made it so that Parliament had to have a vote on whether or not to allow Brexit. And then one person took on the government, went to court and won. Amazing, amazing. What a contribution that is. This guy, Marcus Rashford, has just meant that 1.3 million children over the summer are going to get £15 of the poorest people in this country and to get money to spend in supermarkets. The contribution of ethnic minority people, and which is probably the term that I would advocate using, ethnic minority, because it covers everyone from Irish through to Asians, through to Black Africans, through to Caribbean people from the Caribbean. Okay, so part of passing the GCSE, as I've mentioned before, is either you have to do a letter, a speech, or write an article for a newspaper, or it can be a leaflet. If you want to see where a lot of further information, or you want to see a video on the what we've been discussing, colonialization in India, then Shashi Thorai has done a brilliant one. If you do the search here on that one, then you'll get, you know, a lot of facts and figures, and a lot more than I've done today. The other thing you could think about is, in the introduction to this video, there were headlines that we used, and part of your GCSE, if you're doing a newspaper, could be to write a headline, and they just like, it doesn't have to be the most imaginative headline, but they do like a headline, and doing a headline actually helps you to summarize the key points of an argument. So you might want to watch the video and have a think about the key points, and then try and come up with a headline for it, to try and think about how you would, if you were writing that, how you would headline what you were writing about. I think the other thing you can do is the speeches done in the Oxford Union, which is where they have a debating society at Oxford University. One of the things you may have to do for your GCSE is write a speech. So if you think about, have a look at how he does it. He introduces himself, ladies and gentlemen, makes people laugh, and then he goes through and look at the language he uses, and he's got a particular style, and as people do in speeches, there's not one style fits all, but have a look at how he does his speeches, because I think it'll help you understand how you might write a speech if you were arguing for banning cars in city centres or whatever. Okay, so we're now moving on to mindset. One of my favourite people on the internet is this guy, Better Than Tomorrow, better than yesterday, better than tomorrow, better than yesterday, and he does short videos. This video is 11 minutes long. I showed you a video in a previous episode of this, where the 2-minute theory, where you can, if you do something for 2 minutes, pick up a guitar, put your trainers on to go for a run, or read a book, which I'm doing at the moment. I'm reading for 2 minutes. I think, instead of reading the paper, which I do every day, and I suddenly think, get interested and start reading. So it's really good. This one he's done is fascinating. It's based on research in Denmark that showed that people who did exams in the morning did better than people who did exams in the afternoon. So do exams in the afternoon? Well, yeah, maybe, but maybe that's not always possible. But there are certain things you can do that will mitigate against that. So what's the reason for this? It's called your Catholic clock. And if you look at that, you'll find that you have a natural slump between, I think it's 1 and 4 in the afternoon. So what can you do? Well, number one, get between 7 and 9 hours sleep. Number two, avoid carbohydrates at lunch. They give you a slump afterwards. Number three, have a break. And there are 4 things you need to do on a break. You need to not go on a break where you're thinking about work. That isn't a break. Where you're thinking about your study. You need to go and talk to your friends and do something different. You need to go outside. Miles better to go outside. So talk to people, go outside. And what was the other one? Not as distraction. Yeah, and it's not, and don't see a break as lazy. People in the workplace, teachers, whatever, someone having a break or going off somewhere is not being lazy. They're going to come back more productive and more effective. And again, the research shows that. The final thing you can do, and I don't think many workplaces let you do this, but if you can, if you're at home, is have a power nap. And there are certain rules about power naps that he says, that the science says you should do. Should be longer than 5 minutes. No longer than 20 minutes. And there's always this danger, and we've all done this, where you go too far under, you go to sleep and you feel terrible. So you kind of like meditating, you kind of a little bit awake is the only way I can describe it. I'm not very good at this, I've tried. Okay, so thank you for watching this. I hope you guys have enjoyed this and learned quite a bit. The final thing I'm asking you to do today is what I always do, and that is feedback. Bill Gates says, feedback is essential. If you want a growth mindset, which Carol Dweck coined the phrase, if you want to develop your mind, develop as an individual, you have to take feedback, and you have to admit you made mistakes. I make mistakes all the time. I'll do a better video next time than I will have done this time. Even during this video, I've thought, well, I'll move from just the head to the body, and I'll look back and think, well, maybe that's better. So what do you think about the video? What do you think about the content of this? How could it be better? Anything helps. If it's really useful, if you join YouTube and you can post underneath it, and then I'll read that and other people will read that. And if you think, Phil, you really didn't do that justice, or you should have done that differently, that's fine. We won't all necessarily agree, but I think that's part of a healthy democracy, going back to British values. So I really, really, really value any feedback you give me via the feedback on YouTube, even if it means joining. I hope you've enjoyed this. I hope you've learned a lot, and I hope you realise that this country, the UK's wealth was significantly down to the exploitation of slaves and the exploitation of India, amongst other places. Okay, see you next time. Bye. Now that was all.